Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulullah. Usually when they have an opening session for a conference, it's big festivities, people on the stage giving food, giving candy away. You guys got a boring lawyer, so I'm sorry. But consider it a free lawyer for the next 45 minutes, which is not too common. When the brothers reached out and asked me to sort of talk about the issue, which is of contemporary importance or current importance, nothing really crosses our mind more than what's going on in Palestine, out of all honesty. This morning, we met with the mayor of Sacramento for about 2.5 hours, about 2 hours. And you have on every region, whether you're cultural, religious, every different career or high school or college level, professional experience, it's the topic of the room. Anytime you talk with your coworkers, your classmates, it's what everybody discusses, even when it comes to government levels. Even if you're not talking about Palestine, you're talking about Palestine. And so it's something which we think is of its tantamount importance, very important to discuss it. Well, inshallah, over the next, 38 minutes or so, 33 minutes maybe, we're going to give a little background and some tools about how to discuss this with your coworkers, with your neighbors, with your classmates, with the people who legitimately have interest on the topic, but they don't really know where to go to. And so we sort of have this talk broken down into two sections. Trying to find the silent button. The first topic is going to be, the first part will be about really knocking down some misconceptions and some myths. How you can have tools at your disposal, some facts at your background to really knock out some of the misconceptions that are commonly shared when it comes to talking about Palestine or Israel or the Middle East conflict. And the second part, which we'll try to touch on, inshallah, if we have time, is to sort of hit on what are your rights as an American to discuss this, whether in your workplace, whether in your school setting, in your community, what rights are protected under the free speech, the constitutional rights in the US, versus what is not as protected, inshallah. So if we have time at the end, maybe we could have some questions. It all depends how much we get through, and there's a lot to get through. So the first part of the talk is going to be about what are some of the misconceptions that are faced when we talk about Palestine. If you turn to the news media before social media was a thing, 15, 20, 30 years ago, we're commonly told that this is a very long, organic dispute that's lasted centuries or thousands of years old, and it's never going to get solved because it has not been solved. The problems with the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Arabs and the Jews, the Muslims and whatever you want to frame it, is an issue that has been in dispute for thousands of years, for hundreds of years. It was never solved back then. It's not going to be solved now. That's the first, story that we're told. The second one is that because it's so old and because it is so aged, it's too complex for us to address it. Leave it to the experts. And what we've seen recently, there's, anybody claims to be an expert nowadays. Leave it to the experts because it's too complex for the layman to understand, the laywoman to understand. So let's look at the first misconception or myth. Is it really a thousands of year old conflict? If you look at the history of Jerusalem, we'll call it the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Ard al-Mubarak, whatever phrase you want to frame it as, Palestine. If you look at the history of it, and we're going to take the recent history going back 2,000 years. We can go back to, the days of Solomon and Dawood alayhi salam. We can go back. Let's talk about the history where conflict started. When the Romans became a Christian empire, 66, once when the Christians started coming, they started recognizing the faith of Jesus alayhi salam. One of the first acts that the Romans did were to expel the Jews from the land of Jerusalem. One of their first acts. When Constantine, who was the Roman, the leader of the Roman Empire, 324, Emperor Constantine, remember these dates, 324 AD, when he officially embraced Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire, again, they made sure that Jews were kept out of Jerusalem and not allowed into the city. All right? Early Christian rule. Keep the Jews out of the city. This is before the days of Islam. At this time, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was not born yet. This is 324 AD. We're talking, 246 years before he's born. Jews kept out of Jerusalem. It stayed this way. With a brief interlude of when the Persians were in Jerusalem in the 615, 617, it stayed this way. No Jews allowed to live in Jerusalem. No Jews allowed to work in Jerusalem. Until when? Who here knows when the Jews were allowed back into Jerusalem? We're talking, we're right at this point, we're 1400 years back. What was the event that opened the doors for the Jews to re-enter Jerusalem and live there? It was the opening of Jerusalem by Umar ibn Khattab in the year 637 AD. With the brief intercession of 2 or 3 years when the Persians were in control, there were no Jews allowed in Jerusalem until 637 AD when the Muslims came and took Jerusalem. Anybody know who it was that led the campaign of Umar ibn Khattab? Abu Ubaid ibn Jarrah, Khalid ibn Walid. One of Umar ibn Khattab, our Khalif, the leader of the Muslims at that time, one of his first acts was to bring the Jews back to the city. Because the belief amongst the Muslims was that every faith should have the right to practice freely in the city. Every faith should have the right to live freely in Jerusalem. So Jews were back in Jerusalem. Muslims were in control of Jerusalem from 637 until the end of the First Crusade, 1099 AD. So here you got 450, 470 years of Muslim rule. The Muslims lost Jerusalem, result of the First Crusade. What were some of, again, think the same thing as Constantine. What was one of the first acts of King Godfrey? King Godfrey of Boulogne. What was one of his first acts when the Christian king won the Crusades and took over the city of Jerusalem? Kick him out. Kicked out the Jews again. Slaughtered the Muslims and the Jews who were left. Whoever survived, they were out. King Godfrey of Boulogne, his brother, his child, his brother Baldwin kept the same policy. A French king leading Jerusalem. This is what the Crusades were. Jews were not allowed in the city again. History repeats itself. Were not allowed in the city until several years later. And who was it that opened the city again, brought the Muslims back, and also brought the Jews back in? Was a Muslim leader, Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. You're looking at 89 years again, Jews were expelled from the city. When Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi came back and recaptured Jerusalem after the Second Crusades, one of his first acts, opened the city again for worship. Jews came in. With some, interludes of different dynasties who ran Jerusalem, controlled Jerusalem from that time, be it the Ayyubids in 1178, be it the Mamalik, be it the Ottomans, Jews kept a presence in Jerusalem at all times under Muslim rule. There was never an expulsion of other faiths from Jerusalem. So if we hear the story that this is a thousands of year old conflict between Arabs and Jews, or Muslims and Jews, or everybody and everybody, you stop and say, well, we've really seen over the past 2 millennia, 2,000 years, the only one that's evicted the people from Jerusalem were the Christian kings, and the ones that brought the Jews back to Jerusalem were the Muslim leaders. So how is this really a thousands of year old conflict in which people are kicking other people out of the land? It doesn't relate to us. The Muslims were not the ones who expelled the Jews. We were the ones who brought them back. You look at the relationship, the interfaith relationship after the Inquisition in Spain. When King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella removed the Muslims lost Spain. Muslims and Jews were kicked out of Andalusia. And where did a lot of the Jews seek refuge and receive refuge? In the Muslim lands of North Africa. That's why we have so many Jews you see now from Morocco, Tunisia, that region. So this conception, this belief that it's a centuries or a millennia-year-old conflict between Muslims and Jews, it's just not supported by history. It's not supported by fact. If you read about Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, you'll see that one of his biggest legacies, even amongst the Jewish historians, his biggest legacy is that he kept the city open for the Jewish people to worship, to live, and even if you go forward with other Muslim rules under the Ottomans, to own property, to serve as military advisors, to serve as ministers under the Ottoman government. If there is such a hatred between Muslims and Jews, why was there such freedom at that time? We'll get into a little bit when that changed. Obviously, we know with the introduction of colonialism into the Middle East, a lot of this changed. And we'll see who changed that in a moment. But the takeaway is that under, a millennia and a half, 1,500 years of Muslim rule, Jews enjoyed just as many rights in Jerusalem as the Muslims did. Property rights, land rights, government roles. They were exempt from taxes, and they were not forced to pay taxes as the Muslims were for zakat. So this concept again of this is a decades or a centuries old, millennia old, thousands of year old conflict just is not supported by history. The second misconception, it's too complicated. Has anybody here been watching the proceedings of the International Court of Justice between South Africa and Israel? Has anyone watched that? It comes on at 1 a.m. here, which is 10 a.m. In The Hague, so the times are not good. But we've been staying up and watching it from 1 a.m. until 4 a.m. And if you watch that, it tells you very clearly, it's not complicated. Not at all. Palestine, the land of Palestine, is the longest existing military occupation in the world as of right now. That means that the Palestinian people and the Palestinian territory has been enduring the longest presence of a foreign military longer than any other nation in the world. When the Americans were in Afghanistan, they stayed 20 years. When the Americans were in Iraq, they stayed about 14 to 16 years. Vietnam had different cycles of military occupation. The Japanese, the French, the Americans, the Chinese at one point. You have military occupations. Palestine is the longest. If you look at 1967, you could take that. You got 56 years of a foreign military occupying Palestinian land. That's the international community's opinion of 1967. If you have the belief of 1948, then you got, a few more years. You got 75 going on 76 years. If you want to believe that, and I think is historically supported, that it's longer than that, then you go back to the 1917 colonialism of Palestine. So let's talk about that. The Jews wanted a homeland because, again, they were being persecuted in Europe. We know that, again, by the Christian leaders. In 1884, the European leaders all got together and said, we are going to divide Africa. They started dividing Africa, called the Berlin Conference. You might read about this in your history books. If you're a poli-sci major or a history major, you know this. They brought a map of Africa, imagine a map, and Kaiser Wilhelm of what is now Germany, Queen Victoria of what is the UK, started dividing territory. You take this desert, you take this mountain. It's an absurd concept right now for us to think about it, but this is history. It's a very absurd concept. You take Mount Kilimanjaro, and you take Lake Victoria. It was never called Lake Victoria. It was after the Queen. Let's take this country and make it into Nigeria, where we have 250 languages stuffed into one territory. That's what we call it. We make these arbitrary lines of Zimbabwe. It was called Rhodesia. Let's create Uganda. This was the Berlin Conference of Africa. So the Jews wanted a homeland. The Zionist movement began in the late 1800s. They wanted a homeland. Okay, they could have a homeland. That's great. Everybody wants a homeland, right? Initially, there was a Uganda scheme where Theodore Herzl thinks we will have a homeland in Uganda. Why Uganda? Why not Palestine at that time? Many rabbis were saying we should not have a Jewish state in the Holy Land until the second coming of their belief of the Messiah. So many Jews were actually against the establishment of a Jewish homeland in the Holy Land. So the Uganda scheme at one point was proposed. 1903 is the exact date. Jews didn't get their homeland, stayed quiet. World War I broke out in 1914, the famous slap that shook the world. 1916, the Ottomans figured they sided with the wrong side of history. The Ottoman Empire starts to weaken. What happens when empires collapse? It's a land grab, right? It's not the nation state system you think today where every nation is separate. It's an empire that encompasses thousands of square miles. The Ottomans were from North Africa to the Middle East to what is modern-day Turkey, parts of modern-day Iraq, a huge swath of land. It's going to collapse. It's a land grab. This is where the colonial history of the Middle East begins, where you start seeing European nations entering foreign land. And that is what colonialism is. It's the presence of a foreign party on indigenous territory, non-indigenous territory, administering an indigenous population. It is a man from Mars ruling a man from Venus. Got nothing to do with it. Or in the case of World War I, at the end of it, it's a bunch of Europeans running the Middle East. We know North Africa was divided with the Italians and the French. We know that the Egyptians had a stronghold on Egypt. But for the purpose of this discussion, let's talk about the Holy Land. In 1916, you have these politicians, Sykes-Picot, Mark Sykes on the British side, and Francois-Georges Picot on the French side. They're thinking, okay, the Levant is falling, the Holy Land is falling. So they decide to make this diplomatic agreement where we will divide this territory under something called the OETA. Look at what this term is, what it stands for, OETA. It's called the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration. This is the name that the French and the British gave to the Sham region, the Levant region, which is currently Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. The OETA. Look at the name, the Occupied Enemy Territory Administration. They're already viewing it as enemy territory. These are people from thousands of miles away. So the idea is the British will colonize what do we currently know as Jordan and Palestine, and the French will colonize Lebanon and Syria. In order to administer this, you have to appoint a representative government. Representative of whom? Of the colonizer. So the British mandate starts in Palestine in the year 1920. The British mandate, they send British military personnel. They ensure, just as was happening in India, all exports are going to the UK. They ensure that this is a British colony. And this was the status of Palestine from 1920 to 1948. It was colonized. It was called Palestine. It was known as Palestine. That's what they called it. There's no denial of the name. You look at the coins, the maps, the passports, it was called Palestine. So anybody who says there's never been a state of Palestine, just tell them to get lost is the easiest answer. But it was called Palestine. That's what it was called. Jordan was called Jordan. Parts of it went to the Jordan River. It was called Transjordan at one point. Syria, Greater Syria, Lebanon, that's what these areas were. So this was the introduction of the nation state. Palestine, which was the full Palestine. It was from the river to the sea, the full Palestine. Jordan was Jordan. Lebanon was Lebanon. Syria was Syria. There was also Sudan and Egypt and various other states that were formed at that time. And this was the status from 1920 until you go to World War II. Again, Jews were persecuted. Where were they persecuted? Up north in Europe. They weren't persecuted in Palestine. Holocaust took place, massacre, killing of millions of Jews throughout Europe, again by Christian leaders, doing it in the name of establishing the perfect race. That's what their belief was. So they slaughtered all these Jews. The belief was after that, we need to make amends for what we did to the Jewish people. Again, the Europeans screwed up, other people paying the price. We need to make amends for what we did to the Jewish people. So there was this document drafted a couple of, decades before the Balfour Declaration, give the Jewish people a homeland. It wasn't really established. The mandate's expiring. They said, all right, it's our chance to give this nation that we have, we're British, we control this nation, give it to the Jews, make it Palestine. The British mandate expired May 14, 1948. The British said, we are withdrawing, we are ending our colonial activities. The following day, the state of Israel declares their independence. May 1948. Who recognized the state of Israel? The same guys in Europe. Because they know they really screwed up. Once, twice, three times. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was quiet when the Jews were being killed. The policy of appeasement, we called it. Let them be killed, just keep the Nazis away from Germany, away from the UK. It caught up with them. Then he said, all right, how can we make amends? Give them a homeland. But they forget there were people on that homeland. I think tomorrow we'll have another talk talking about sort of the identity of it. But there are people on that homeland. My grandmother was from a village called El Burj, which is now a scenic farm of trees, what it's called, completely destroyed. So people who were living in Palestine, what is called in 1948 Palestine, wars broke out. They said, we're not giving up our territory. They were cleansed. Deir Yassin happened. 750,000 Palestinians fled their homes to what is now the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And then the Judaization or the Israelization of Palestinian land happened. You see cities change names. Netanya, Heard the name Netanya? Anybody? The city? The historical name is Khalid. Anybody know where Netanya, where the name is from? Netanya. Who is it named after? No, not Netanyahu wasn't here. No, Netanya. Not that's a close, but no cigar. Anybody here shop at Macy's at all? I admit I've been to Macy's. Anybody shop at Macy's? The founder of Macy's, the city of Netanya was named after him. They gave him a namesake, so he will come and establish his roots there. I'll let you do your own research. The founder of Macy's. This is history. This is history. Deir Yassin. You've heard of Deir Yassin, the site of Deir Yassin. What is Deir Yassin today? It's been razed and converted to a mental hospital. There's no city there anymore. Called the Kafar Shal Medical Center. It's a psychiatric hospital. Completely erased the Palestinian identity there. My grandmother's from Al Burj. They knocked the village down, the people displaced. It's now a sanctuary of trees. Very catchy name, right? Every time a foreign leader comes, they plant a tree there to show our love for the state of Israel and our brotherly feeling. But those trees are on a Palestinian village that was destroyed. This is the history of Palestine. Maliha, where my brother is from, is now a huge shopping mall. This is the history of Palestine. So when we talk about colonialism, you don't get worse than this. Now, we can talk about military occupation. You know, this continued in 1967. The West Bank was captured. Settlements came. Gaza Strip was captured by the Israeli military, funded by the U.S. weapons and army. Kafar, Gush Khativ, 17 settlements in the Gaza Strip. When you hear the term, we are going to return to Gaza, we are going to establish Gush Khativ, that is the name of the Israeli settlement block in the Gaza Strip, which was there. Hundreds of thousands of Israeli settlers currently live in the West Bank. Currently, right now. So it's not enough that 1948 was gone. Now we're taking over whatever's left. These are things you have to tell to your coworkers. These are things you have to know. The international community, even the US, as much as we disagree with this foreign policy, acknowledges the occupation of Palestinian land. Until now. There's no question about that. Now, what does that Palestinian state? That's a discussion for a different day. But at minimum, it's the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem. That is internationally acknowledged, even by the US. Internationally acknowledged. The problem is you can't do that as long as there are settlements that carve out like a jigsaw puzzle. You can't do that as long as you have settlers who are living there in the Hebron area where Khalil is taking 94% of the water. You can't do that when villages, where my mother is from, Beit Tiksa, 94% of the village is gone because this occupation wall took the village out. Our good friend Bassem al-Qarras from the village in the West Bank, when they built the line, they put the water wells on the Israeli side of the armistice line, not on the Gaza side. Our good friend Bassem al-Qarras, his village has no more water wells there because when they drew the armistice line, they drew them onto the Israeli side. I mean, this has been a long strategic plan of how to move the Palestinians out. What we're seeing now in Gaza since October is just the newest episode. This is going to happen time and again and time and again. You have to know this. Some statistics, imprisonment of Palestinians since 1967, 1 million Palestinians have entered Israeli jails. Currently, right now, 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank, 2.3 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. So you say about 4.6 million Palestinians there. This number grows over the years, arguably, right? So you look at their population of men over the age of 18. 1 million Palestinians have entered Israeli jails. You know what the conviction rate is for Palestinian men who are subject to Israeli military court? The conviction rate, 99.2%. If you're charged with a crime and you're arrested in the occupied territories, you're arrested in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, you are subject to a military court. Over a 99% conviction rate. You know what the conviction rate for settlers are who are arrested in those territories? 3%. You have to know these numbers. I mean, people say the US is the most, we have the highest incarceration rate in the world. They haven't met the Palestinians, man. 99% is insane, but this is the reality. So the takeaway is that Is this complicated? It's a simple case of land theft. If you're from Indonesia, you remember the case of East Timor. If you're from China, you remember the case of Hong Kong. If you're from Algeria, you remember the case of colonialism from the French. Now in the news, we're talking about Russia and the Ukraine. This is a case of land theft is all it is. Nothing more, nothing less. We've been watching for the past 2.5 days, for those who have been watching the ICJ, International Court of Justice's hearings about the claim of genocide. And if you listen to the South Africans present, you'll see that the vast majority of the South African legal team is from South Africa. From Durban, Johannesburg, from South Africa. They're saying, we've been through this. We've lived under apartheid. We've lived under occupation. We've lived under colonialism. This is personal to us. And they keep coming back, occupation, Palestinian massacres. And they're building this up to show that there's an Israeli intent of genocide. Whether there is or not, they'll leave that for the ICJ to decide. But who's on the Israeli side presenting this? Did anybody watch last night's arguments by the Israeli side? You saw it? Anybody else see it? What did you notice about people speaking? Yeah, okay. What else did you notice? Their accents. Tal Decker, who is the big guy that started off, Australian. Malcolm Shaw, British. Christopher Staker, British. These are the people defending the Israeli side. Again, it's this common theme of colonialism again. And if you look at what they're arguing, their defense is not about, no, they're saying procedurally, South Africa did not give us a chance to respond, so we don't belong here. That's what they're saying. We don't belong here because they cannot fight it substantively. They know the substance is there. They're saying South Africa gave us notice in December 22nd, 21st, I believe it was. They filed their case 29th. They did not give us a chance to respond to their claim, so we don't belong here. Or they say, but the Palestinians did this, but the Palestinians did that. They won't even address the substance of the claim. You look at who else is on the Israeli side. Omri Sender. This guy's legal counsel to the World Bank, and he's there defending Israel in the International Court of Justice. You have a World Bank attorney defending the Israelis in the International Court of Justice. It's right? You have to follow the colonialists. You got to follow their money, you got to follow their power. The problem is the occupation. It's not a complicated issue. It's very black and white. It's very straightforward. People ask, how do we talk to your coworkers? Simple, stick to the facts. Stick to the facts, that's all it is. A loss of life is evil on both sides. Nobody can ever condone or support the killing of a civilian. Doesn't matter who does it. But this didn't start in October. If you want to go back to 67, great. If you want to go back to 1948, great. I think you go back to 1916, 1917. You see, this was the plan. The plan was to divide an indigenous land amongst non-indigenous people. We all love the British. I don't know what the French give us. They give us good food, but that's about all they give us. I don't think the British give us good food. But unfortunately, that's where this process began. You have to know the history. So I got a few minutes left. I want to quickly touch on the legal aspect of it. Anybody who works in with a private employer, meaning non-government, anybody that attends a private school, meaning non-public, if you do not work for a government institution, and if you do not attend a public school, your First Amendment freedom of speech rights do not apply to you. Okay? If I work for ABC Canning Company, and it's owned by John Smith, he's a private employer. First Amendment rights do not apply to you. What is the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise or the freedom or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of people to peaceably assemble to petition the government. Congress. This was written over 200 years ago. We did not have state, local, and city governments. We had Congress. Constitutional Congress, that's what it was. So the term Congress here means government. So government cannot restrict your freedom of religion, your freedom of speech, your freedom of the press, your freedom to petition, or your freedom to complain, your freedom to protest. Government cannot restrict those. Private entities can. There are obviously discrimination laws that apply, but generally you do not have as much leeway to speak out if you work for a private employer or if you attend a private school. This is important for many people. They want to get active, they want to chat out. That's why Instagram could shut down your account like that, right? It's a private entity. If the state of California, for example, has like an employee web board where all employees put their thoughts, they can't really target you. But Meta could shut you down tomorrow because it's a private entity. If you attend a private institution and you speak out and you really anger some people, you could probably lose your job if it's arguable against our code of conduct. If you attend a public institution, you have a little more rights. There are some exceptions. To this. You cannot harass people. You cannot. Okay? You cannot touch somebody. You could shout at people maybe from a safe distance. You cannot defame non-public officials. You cannot accuse your professor of being a child killer. That's not free speech. You cannot do anything which is deemed obscene, meaning you cannot do anything which will shock the conscience of those who are watching. Free speech might include holding up a picture of a dead child, might include that. It might not include holding up a picture of a dead child with no head. That could be deemed obscene. You get it? So there's a case, Supreme Court case called Tinker, is in Des Moines, Iowa. A bunch of students in Vietnam, they wanted to make an anti-war protest, days of Vietnam. They wore these black ribbons on their arm. Silent protest. You wear the black ribbon, you want the troops to come home, end the war. They were disciplined and dumped from school. They sued. Supreme Court said, this is a silent protest. They're not disrupting school. They're not disrupting the day-to-day impact of the facility. This is protected under the First Amendment. So people say, what can I do on campus? What can I do at work? If you disrupt the day-to-day affairs, you're probably going to get in trouble. Maybe it's worth it. It's up to you. If you protest on a sidewalk, you have the right to protest on a sidewalk, right? You could do that. You can do that. If you shut down traffic, yeah, it's up to you. You might get in trouble because you are disrupting society at that point, right? You're disrupting society. If you go to a coffee shop that has a green logo of a lady and you protest on the sidewalk saying you are punishing your employees that are calling out a massacre, can you do that from the sidewalk? Yes, you can. You can. Can you walk into that private business and do that from the private business? No. You have to know your rights. You use them. You know your rights, use them. Shout, scream, petition, write letters, drive the hell out of your elected officials. Make their lives miserable when you see them in public. Make their lives miserable. You got to be smart though. This is advice we give to everybody, especially the younger people. If you feel that you are in an employment situation or an academic situation where you fear that you will be retaliated against because of your political views, think twice. There's plenty of activists, alhamdulillah. There's a lot of activists. Let's say there's 100 of us, for example. It's easy enough. There's 100 of us, right? If you get in trouble at school because you say something obscene, offensive, you cause a ruckus, that number went from 100 to 99, right? There's still 99 of us, right? But you have been locked out of a career, a life-changing opportunity for yourself. So be smart about this. Be smart about it. There's plenty of activists out there. There's plenty of ways to get involved, but be aware of your limitations. Remember, no fighting words, no threatening, no harassing, no obscenity, nothing that will shock the conscience of everybody. When I was in high school in 2002, early 2003, the bombing of Iraq started, March 2003. I had a shirt. You ever seen the I Heart New York shirts? I've never seen those. I Heart NY. That was a hothead. I crossed out NY with a red mark and I wrote Iraq underneath it. And I went to school. I had no idea what I was doing. All right? But every single person saw me and said, nice shirt, or screw you, man. One of the two. The school couldn't do anything. Freedom of speech couldn't do anything. I was not disrupting class. If you don't like it, don't look at it. I was not closing classrooms. We were not shutting down roads. That was protected speech. If you want to go to work and you want to have a ribbon, or you want to go to school and have a Palestine pendant, great. It might be restricted a little more if you go to a private school. There might be dress codes, codes of conduct, or if you work in a private institution, there might be dress codes, codes of conduct, non-political activity. Be aware of that. SubhanAllah, the final message is, I say this every time we talk about this topic, is not to forget your brothers and your sisters in Palestine, in Gaza. Every time we see a child, we picture that being our child. Every time we see a mother, you see that's my mother, that's my father. Every time you see an older person, you think that's my grandpa, that's my granddad, that's him. The people of Palestine will be judged on the day of judgment. The people in Gaza, in Palestine, and anyone who is oppressed will be judged on how they dealt with the adversity that they faced. They'll be judged how they persevered in the face of adversity, in the face of suffering. They'll be judged how, whether they turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or not, when facing adversity, because they are in an adverse, sub-peripheral situation. Us in the West, we're a little different. We have everything, right? We generally have everything. We're going to be judged how we face this while enjoying our prosperity. Did we speak when we saw an injustice? When we saw something wrong, did we change that evil with our hand? Or if not with our hand, with our tongue? If not with our tongue, with our heart? Did we do that? Or did we just pretend nothing is going on and that's it? You'll be judged on that. You'll be judged on that. So, Jazakallah khair. I know the time flew past. Based on me talking, I don't see much time for Q&A. So, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.